Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Rob Farley from the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. And with me today is Dr. Greg Weeks from UNC Charlotte. How are you doing today, Greg?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Could you introduce yourself for the viewers?
Sure, I'm Greg Weeks. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte.
Fantastic. Now, there is some significant news today with respect to Cuba, news that you sort of forecast a couple days ago when you wrote a post about what the future of US-Cuba policy might look like. Anyway, so what has everybody aflutter this morning?
Well, it's all Cuba, so that President Obama is using executive action to open up Cuba to a degree that we haven't seen in over 50 years. So it's going to be economics, going to be travel. It's not a full end to the embargo because that sits in Congress, but this is a very, very big deal.
Right. And so when the news initially broke, it looked like it was just going to be a fairly, the news broke over the course of, half an hour, something along those lines. And initially it looked sort of fairly narrow, that it was going to be Alan Gross for 3 Cubans. But it significantly broadened after that. And so what do you know? What have you read so far about sort of the negotiations and everything that led up to this?
Well, from what I've seen, the Pope played a significant role.
Right.
And so what the two sides needed was kind of an honest broker to go between them. And since the Pope is Latin American, obviously he saw himself as a natural connection between the two. So this is the culmination of months of negotiation. And so, it's not something that happened out of the blue, but rather had been brewing for some time behind the scenes.
Right. And now the Canadians, as I understand it, also played some role in the facilitation. I don't know if you saw those reports that happened through Canadian auspices and the Canadian offices along with the pontiff.
No, I hadn't, but that makes sense. I mean,
right.
Cuba trusts Canada, and Canada is a U.S. ally, so they'd also be natural to be a go-between.
Right. So, for our viewers who don't pay a ton of attention, what were the state of U.S.-Cuba relations before this? How did things look in terms of like the legal relationship before this morning, with the restrictions that Americans had on travel to Cuba and vice versa?
Well, I mean, it was very tightly controlled by the Treasury Department. That you couldn't travel, you can't have trade except under very limited agricultural trade for cash. Foreign subsidiaries get targeted. There's just all kinds of restrictions on virtually any kind of interchange with Cuba, a limited amount of remittance money that can be sent back. So we were closed off from Cuba in a way we're not closed off from almost any other country in the world.
Right. And under the restrictions of Helms-Burton, in other words, there were other legislation. There was also sort of limitations on our ability to do business with businesses that dealt with Cuba in other fashion. Right. I mean, so it was pretty far-reaching in terms of legislative restriction.
Yeah, it was direct and indirect. We wanted to basically get at countries that traded with Cuba at all, even if they weren't necessarily U.S. companies. So, again, it's something that it was so extreme, and we don't hardly see it against any other country at all.
Right. Now, to your reading, I know, so you're a Latin American specialist, and so you've paid attention, but I'm a foreign policy specialist, and I've paid attention to it too. How much of the continuation of this was sort of this leftover Cold War thing? How much of it was domestic politics in the United States? Was just something that was sitting there hanging over U.S. politics, one of those things we can't change, or like the Electoral College? And how much was sort of like, viscerally still motivated in the U.S. as that this was a good idea?
I don't think there are very many people in the U.S. who still think this is a good idea. But if you have a policy issue that a few people care passionately about and other people don't care a whole lot about, then they can control the agenda. Then you add the really weird angle of Florida and the Electoral College, and that throws a wrench into everything. And so, it stuck after the Cold War because Democrats really wanted to win Florida. Republicans were going to change it because they had conservative Cuban Americans who cared about it. But Democrats didn't want to mess around with Florida. And so it stuck just because of that. I mean, largely. Cuba's on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, but there's very, very few people who actually take that very seriously for the past decade at least. So this was all, I mean, it was all domestic politics and largely Florida politics.
Right. And now, I mean, the logic seems to be either, now the logic seems to, I guess, from my point of view, I'd always sort of expected that this was going to be, at some point, the Democrats were just going to give up on Florida. But it seems like sort of the opposite. Now they think that the Cuban American population that still is in favor of the embargo is largely unreachable, and the rest of it will probably outweigh that. So they can win Florida even without the Cuban embargo. I guess that was sort of my domestic reading of it.
Yeah, well, and demography matters too, because younger Cuban Americans don't care so much about the embargo. They're not connected in a personal way to the revolution itself. And so that younger Cuban Americans were perfectly happy to support the Democratic Party. They were interested in other issues. And so what you have is a group of people who are stuck and saying, look, we cannot ever get rid of the embargo, but they are getting older and they are not the dominant force that they once were.
Right. It's and I think that, there are some other domestic lobbies that work in the same way. This group was so ironclad that it had become apparent that they're not a swing, right? When you become so ironclad that there's no chance of you swinging, then you effectively become irrelevant, right? To both sides, especially when your numbers are diminishing. So,
yeah, no.
Right. What do you know? And this was over the years, and this is ranging a little bit, but over the years, I have also seen some discussion of sort of trade-oriented constituencies developing along the Gulf Coast in Mississippi, Alabama, and elsewhere that are Republican-controlled states, but that have not that much interest in the Florida community, especially, but that were interested in trade with Florida. Have you ever heard anything about sort of an anti-embargo group developing along those lines? Or
yeah, well, I mean, they're not necessarily a coherent group, but what people don't know is that for years and years, Republican governors have taken large entourages to Cuba to talk agriculture. They might not want to make a big deal about it because they might get backlash from their own party. But there's a lot of people a lot of politicians who see their states as benefiting from trade. Oil companies are hot for Cuba. The poultry industry has increased its trade with Cuba. So there is a growing group, and I think maybe just gradually over time, they were starting to get more of a unified voice, or at least they were all separately talking to the president. And my opinion is that this also accelerated after the 2008 crash, because businesses are saying, why are you blocking us out of a good market when we're in desperate need of revenue right now?
Right. I mean, especially since sort of the worldwide blockade of Cuba collapsed, right? And so everyone is able to take advantage of the Cuban market except for the United States, right? Which is sort of the major natural partner for Cuba. So, could you talk a little bit about the Alan Gross case? I mean, I actually have a small family connection because he lived on the street that my sister-in-law lives on in Potomac, Maryland. So I know a little bit about it. Do you know? What could you say about the Alan Gross case, if anything, which is sort of one of the cruxes of this deal?
Well, I mean, for me, it just seems tragic because the guy was obviously well-meaning, but what he was doing was illegal. So he was going into Cuba and he was trying to help people with communications, which, is obviously a noble purpose, but it was really unfair to stick him into that kind of a situation, knowing that if he's arrested, the Cubans are going to throw him in jail.
Right.
They're going to see him as a spy because they see everybody as a spy. They've been attacked by the U.S. so many times, they figure anybody, no matter what they say, it's an agent of the CIA. So I think it was tragic in the sense that he was put into that position at all. But the Cubans saw him as a spy, and that's why the Cuban Five for the Castros became a logical swap, because they saw them as pushing a noble purpose in preventing Cuban American terrorism.
Right.
So both countries said, hey, those are spies. But in fact, both of them were doing things that most ordinary people would think, hey, that's not so bad.
Right, exactly. And the Cubans also got somebody else in exchange, right? Someone No, we got someone else in exchange for
Yeah,
the five, right? Some agent.
that's like a baseball trade,
Right.
like to be named later. I don't know who the person is, but
Right.
he was put well.
The spy who will be revealed later is
Yeah.
sort of what it was. Now, do you have any sense? And I know we're really coming up with the details, and there will still be sort of significant restrictions on things. But do you get a sense of how trade and travel are going to change within the next couple months, couple of years between the United States and I mean, this is not a case where we can just sort of hop the first jet to Havana or hop the first boat to Havana and party like it's 1959. I mean, this is going to be sort of a little bit slower in developing because of the legislative. Is that right? Or
Yeah, well, I mean, right now it's not easy to get to Cuba. So this is going to require even discussions with airlines about how this would work. Now, it doesn't open up tourism. So, it's not as broad as some people might hope, but it does mean that we're going to have to think infrastructure, direct flights, not just charters. And that can't happen right away. But I'm willing to bet that things move faster than people think because if both sides are particularly on the U.S. side, are really into it, well, then executive action is going to open the door, and people are going to start figuring out a way as fast as possible to start making it happen.
right. And I mean, another way I was thinking about it too is that the embargo has sort of been a hill to die on for a lot of sort of people with this connection with the Cuban American community. But guess what? That hill has been lost, right? That hill has been taken, and people have now died upon that hill. And so, it seems like the benefits of getting sort of fully involved within the Cuban market now are gonna overwhelm that sort of political objection to pushing forward. Maybe I don't. It's strange that it has persisted that long, but
Yeah, I think this is going to be a popular move over time. I don't know how long it would take for the embargo to be lifted, but I mean, I just think that even for younger Cuban Americans, this gives them more opportunity to connect to their families, more ability to send money to their families. It's going to be something that people are going to like. People even in Florida are going to like, and Republicans are not going to be able to keep ignoring that.
Right. So, one of the questions that has been occurring to me, and that sort of is the center of how a lot of people think about this, is not the effect in the United States, but what effect this is going to have in Cuba. What does, from your sense of what Cuban politics looks like right now and what the Cuban economy looks like right now, and I know we're going to be speculating and hazarding some guesses here, how does this shift destabilize, transform Cuban society and economy? What sort of potential does it have on that level?
Well, I wouldn't expect any huge shift right away. But I think the one thing that it really does is that it starts to undercut the Castro regime's use of the U.S. as an excuse for why its economy is in tatters. So, it's going to mean that there's going to be pressure on the Cuban government to perform like any other government. And they're not going to be able to say, well, it's the blockade that is holding us back. It's also going to connect more Cubans to commerce with the U.S. So what that's going to do is also undercut the command economy in Cuba. But, if we look at, everyone compares it to China, and what we see in China is an economy that's more and more and more capitalist, but it's still a dictatorship. Right. So I don't think this is going to necessarily destabilize the Castro government, but we might see once the Castros are gone, a shift that kind of embraces capitalism more and more. And, it's hard to say whether that's going to make it a democracy. I don't think there's necessarily a great chance of that,
right.
But it's going to open opportunities for Cubans.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because, the China example is sort of interesting because foreign trade has the potential to be a much larger percentage of the economy in Cuba than and especially U.S. trade has a potential to be a much larger percentage of the economy if the United States will let it be, which is a different question. And you have this looming generational shift that, of course, you've had those shifts in China before. I guess they did have some sort of very consequential not political outcomes in terms of full democratization, but you did have sort of major generational shifts in the political landscape. that you're sort of that we're going to have in Cuba anyway. There's no way to avoid that within the next few years. So,
yeah, I mean, China also is a troubling case, or not troubling, but it's problematic because the Chinese always say, well, we have this massive population, and this is one reason why we have to have an authoritarian government.
mm-hmm.
And that's not an argument that the Cuban government can make.
Mm-hmm.
If we're lucky, then we're also going to start to see more pressure from Latin American governments on Cuba to democratize. Once we get the U.S. Sort of bugaboo out of the way,
mm-hmm.
then Latin American countries can push Cuba without being seen as kowtowing to the U.S.
Right. So I guess that leads us to the next question. The U.S. has been under pressure from OAS and other organizations for quite a while to become more flexible in Latin or with respect to Cuba. I mean, so in terms of region-wide effects, this is probably going to have a pretty, I wouldn't call it a significant, but at least a positive effect on U.S. Latin American relations.
It will, because what we're doing is we're sending a signal that says, okay, you know what? You've all been telling us that this policy is counterproductive, and we're actually going to listen for one time. And so this is no longer a sticking point between the U.S. and Latin American countries. What it also means is that, like for the Summit of the Americas, which is coming up next year, which ridiculously became centered on, well, what's the U.S. going to do if Cuba comes? Mm-hmm. Instead, the U.S. is going to come, Cuba's going to come, and then the U.S. can hammer Cuba on human rights.
Right.
So it actually is better to have Cuba in these meetings because you can point fingers at them and make them respond. And they're not going to be able to respond by saying, well, you got an embargo. They're going to have to respond by saying, well, this is what we have to do, or try to come up with lame excuses for dictatorship. So I think that in those ways it's positive. Mm-hmm. I actually also think that it's positive in undercutting President Maduro in Venezuela, because he's all about, solidarity in front of the empire, mm-hmm. except that Cuba, his biggest ally, is now saying, oh, well, actually, the U.S. isn't so bad after all.
Right, and that's the next really sort of big question I wanted to get to, right, which is that some people, and the timeline would appear to be wrong here, right? The timeline, some people have talked about sort of the timeline of the collapse in oil prices and attach that to sort of Venezuelan foreign policy and what is looking like a collapse of Venezuela's entire position in Latin America, and associating that with this. But the timeline here does not appear to be correct. I mean, it seems like there's been negotiations for quite a while. But do you get a sense that the Cubans were some of the Cuban logic here was a little bit of hedging with respect to Caracas, with respect to the potential weakness of Venezuela?
It wouldn't surprise me, because one thing, the reason that the Castro brothers are in power is because they're extremely smart people. They're very politically savvy, and they understood that the Maduro government might not last forever, and that even if it lasts for its full term, they don't know who's going to come in the next election. So they had better figure out a way to connect to a bigger economy, if nothing else, to avoid another special period like they had when the Soviet Union pulled the rug out from under them.
Right. And for the same reasons, they can at this time probably be assured that Russia is not going to fill that role as it has in the past. I mean, there might have been some hope earlier this summer, but now the Russians look in as bad a position as Venezuela, potentially worse.
Yeah, exactly. So in many ways, the embargo has been great for the Castro government. It's given it that crutch to blame, but they're getting old and they're scrambling to figure out ways of not collapsing entirely. So I figured that this was a good time to do it.
Right. So, I have asked most of the questions I was interested in. You a baseball fan? Are you a baseball person? Or so,
Padres fan, one of the few and proud.
Well, especially one of the few and proud in your region. Is this going to lead to a change in all these stories we hear about? I mean, does this lay the foundations for a change in all these stories we hear about with all of the great Cuban players having to take just extraordinary means to get to the United States? I mean, obviously that's not going to change overnight, but yeah, it's hard to.
It's pretty fast.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's hard to imagine the Cuban team operating under the same restrictions now as it has in the past, right? I mean, with travel and everything else.
Well, yeah, and I mean now there was just the news about that the Yasiel Puig case,
Hmm.
which is just crazy. But what could well happen is that MLB is going to get in there
Hmm.
and try to figure out, well, what does this mean for us? If it means that players don't have to be smuggled through a third country, well, then that's great. But MLB has agreements with Mexico, they have agreements with Japan, they have agreements with different countries.
Hmm.
So uh, I would bet that baseball could well be one of the groups that is part of this expanded movement of people. I don't know that for a fact.
Hmm.
I think it'd be entirely positive if it was, because the danger and money involved in human smuggling, I think, has been really just awful.
Right, and I mean we're almost certainly going to have some change to the sort of the classic wet foot dry foot policy as a response to this, right? There, I mean that's untenable now if there are greater contacts between Cuba and the United States, right? If somebody can get in a plane and land, that's dry foot, and so you can't maintain that presumably.
And part of what the White House had a fact sheet, and it said specifically that there was going to be renewed migration talks in early 2015.
Okay.
So, given this movement, I'm willing to bet that you're going to see a shift in that too, because, yeah, that's also such a strange policy that's
Hmm.
led to all these crazy things like whether a bridge counts as land or not.
Right.
And, and you're right. If there's a bunch of people on planes, then, this is just a silly sort of policy that's got to be updated.
Right. So when did you think we would see? Back in 2008, I was extremely optimistic about something like this happening with executive action from the Obama administration. I thought we'd see it sooner than this, right? Did you, aside from the fact that you wrote a post on this 2 days ago as to how this would be a great idea, did when previously have you seen something like this finally happening?
Yeah, I was also, I mean, I wouldn't say I expected it, but I was cautiously optimistic when Obama took office because he talked about it,
Right, right.
and even campaigned on it. He went to Miami, talked about it, and I thought, man, he must be serious. And then he just kind of let it slide, and he did some minor things with remittances and stuff. But um, but the default has always been, well, they're just not going to mess with Florida.
Mhm.
And so, I think that the shift, at least in my opinion, one of the biggest shifts was that Obama wants a foreign policy legacy,
Mhm. Right.
and he doesn't really have much at all. He spent almost all of his time in foreign policy is mopping up stuff in the Middle East, dealing with Iran, and also dealing with Russia. So this was something that finally, hey, I'm running out of time.
Right.
And this is the one thing that I can do myself and really do something historic. And so I don't know why it took so long, but it might just be that he finally saw that he didn't have so much time left in office.
Right. I mean, as you were thinking about that, as you were mentioning that, he has spent time resolutely trying to mop up things which are refused to be mopped. Right. With Israel Palestine, which is never going to happen. With Russia Ukraine, which is always going to be a problem. With the Middle East, and
Yeah.
this seems like a resolvable problem.
Yeah. I mean, ISIS, nobody can have a legacy on that. He
Right.
even killed Osama bin Laden, but that's not really an
Right.
achievement in foreign policy. So this was kind of easy. And bizarrely enough, it took 55 years or whatever, but it was actually easier than most of the other things he's dealing with.
Right, right, and it seemed to get taken. It seemed to get taken care of in about 3 hours this morning. Right, that was sort of the. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, well, this thing changed, and now it's okay. Well, now it's different. All right, let's start smoking
Yeah.
cigars.
I'm saying, okay, now I got all these lectures, I got to change. I've been giving these same lectures for years.
Oh yeah,
And in
no,
like 10 minutes, he messed it all up.
right, right. No, a friend of mine on Facebook this morning said, the two biggest thing I've always said is, I use to illustrate political disaster our American drug policy and the Cuba embargo, and now I have to change. And he's from Colorado, and now I have to change both of those because they don't work
Yeah.
anymore. So, to get back a little bit, we talked a little bit about how the Venezuela situation may have affected these negotiations. How does this sort of affect broader sort of Venezuela's, and you're thinking, how does this affect Venezuela's foreign policy position in Latin America? Is this, obviously it's not quite so much as Cuba realigning itself with the United States, but does this carry some implications for how Venezuela should be thinking and approaching its position with respect to the United States right now and Latin America?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what it does is that for now, well over a decade, I mean, about 15 years, Venezuelan foreign policy has been based on the idea that Latin America should unite and exclude the United States. They should move away from the U.S. They should create regional organizations like UNASUR, CELAC, ALBA, et cetera, that are Latin American only. They should trade more with other countries. They should deal with, bring in Russia, China. And in one fell swoop, what Cuba did is say, we were the ones that always hated the U.S., and now we're embracing them. Mm-hmm. Embracing them not in terms of, we agree with them, but really we're reversing our views. And so it's going to be a lot harder for Venezuela to say, hey, we stand firm with Cuba mm-hmm. in fighting against the U.S. because, Cuba has just said, we don't really want to fight with the U.S. anymore. We want to trade with them. And so I think that whole message that Hugo Chavez started and Maduro inherited, it's in trouble.
Yeah. What is I know we're ranging a little bit right now, but do you have, but you do talk about this on the blog sometimes. I mean, do you have, what is your sense of the future of the Maduro regime, right? The future of the Chavez regime with the oil price problems. I mean, I know that the popularity of the regime is very low, but they keep winning elections. With this in mind, how are we looking at Venezuela right now in terms of being a stable political entity?
Well, I mean, stability is going to suffer. Maybe it can get propped up with loans from China or elsewhere, but they're not meant to function on oil being at $50 or $60 dollars a barrel for very long. Legally, there can be a recall vote within, I think, another 2 years or so. Mm-hmm. So no, I think you're bound to see problems in Venezuela. The key in Venezuela is whether the opposition can get its act together. Right. It's been so splintered, and this just shoots itself in the foot over and over and over. And there'd be a good chance for the opposition to win if they could just have a united message that's not about overthrowing the government, mm-hmm. and that's actually saying, hey, we care about people, because a big chunk of the opposition takes pains to sort of say we don't care. Mm-hmm. Then no, I don't. I think it's extraordinarily hard to have any kind of positive outlook for Venezuela in the short to medium term at all.
Right. No, they're one of these. I mean, really, the oil futures problem is very. But they even go beyond the typical oil futures problem, right? Since they couldn't balance their budget even under really sort of extraordinary oil numbers. It was because you would see these charts, and Saudi Arabia can balance at 72, and Russia at 105, and Venezuela at like 280 or something like that, right? Yes. So. They were already disastrous.
Even when oil prices were high, they weren't dealing with problems of crime. They weren't dealing with all these problems that people were concerned about. So if they couldn't deal with it at 110, then how in the world are they going to deal with it at half that price?
Right. All right. Well, I mean, I think this is a good short blogging heads for a good short fascinating topic. So, Greg, thanks for coming on. Unless you have any final thoughts.
No, that's good. This is just so fascinating. I can't even tell you. I spent the whole day just reading and talking about this. It's for someone who studies Latin America, this is just huge. Maybe we do another one of these in a month and see how things are working out at that point. That'd be interesting. Then we can see how some of this stuff actually plays out. Right. And we'll have a better sense of the sort of the details and nitpicks of the policy and how it's playing out in the U.S. And we'll undoubtedly have some fascinating quotes from Marco Rubio and other people that will give us some more grist. So yeah, that's right. As they start really elbowing for a presidential run. All right. Well, Greg, thank you so much. And for Entanglements viewers, thank you as well. Okay. Thank you.